Welcome back to the Resolution Room, where we explore how dialogue, empathy, and creativity can transform how we deal with conflict. Today's episode focuses on a remarkable project that sits at the intersection of research, peacebuilding, and mediation, Talk4Peace. Co-led by Heidi Riley and Dr. Maria-Adriana Deiana, Talk4Peace explores what happens when mediation isn't just a process for resolving disputes, but a way of reimagining how we talk, listen, and connect, both locally and globally. We'll talk about how the project came to life, what transformative mediation really means in practice, and how this work connects to the wider unmet mediation needs across Ireland. So, Heidi, to kick us off, can you please explain what Talk4Peace is all about?
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us today. So Talk4Peace is a collaborative research programme led by myself and Maria. A collaboration between myself at University College Dublin and Maria's at Queen's University. So it was part of the North-South Research Programme, funded by the Shared Island Programme. And the focus was really on looking at what we mean by transformative mediation, looking beyond the transformation just of relationships, but transformation of structures, of inequalities that are often the root cause of conflict. The focus was very much kind of looking at alternative ways of carrying out mediation and alternative mechanisms for mediation that can be used within transformative processes.
Fascinating. And Maria, what drew you into this collaboration from your work in gender and peace studies?
Yes, well, both myself and Heidi are interested in gender dynamics of conflict transformation and peace building. And one of the key aspects of this project was thinking about how to connect transformative mediation so that we could actually achieve more inclusive processes of dialogue. So gender, of course, was one of the key elements that obviously was at stake for us. And there is also at stake in the literature within research in this field. But in the project, we also try to expand our ideas around inclusive dialogue and to think about not only gender in isolation, but also to think about other aspects and other axes of people positionality that may be necessary to be taken into account when we're trying to design processes of dialogue which are inclusive. And so gender, of course, is important in terms of thinking about not only who is on the table, but also how do we ensure that transformative mediation is also thinking about a wider range of structures that may prevent the inclusion not only of women, but also other minoritized groups.
Gotcha. So there's an intersectionality at play?
Absolutely. Yes.
Understood. Okay. I think I'm right in saying that you both come from different professional worlds. How did the idea for Talk4Peace take shape?
Well, we both do come from kind of academic backgrounds, but at the same time, I suppose I have a practical experience in the arts, and Maria also has research experience in the arts as well. So this was another area that we sought to include in the project. In our initial discussions around the development of the research programme was also, I suppose, how we can incorporate the role of the arts in mediation processes as well. And so from that, and particularly, of course, our interest in gender and gender and conflict resolution, we wrote a research proposal from that perspective, and we're fortunate enough to be able to get the grant and continue with the research.
Yes, and I guess we were also interested in thinking about, essentially in the literature, we found a lot of work done on how mediation is used in order to reach an agreement. But we found much less, at least within the peace studies literature and within the mediation literature, on how actually mediation can become an important tool that actually needs to continue well after a ceasefire or an agreement has been signed. And of course, being in Northern Ireland, of course, we have a lot of knowledge and examples of the ways in which mediation is used and continue to be used now, many years, many decades after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So it was also a way of for us to think about how do we build on some of the knowledge that exists in the island of Ireland to actually propose a different way of thinking about mediation, the different role that it can have post-agreement, but also a different way of thinking about mediation in transformative sense. And so how do we apply that, not only pre-agreement, but also how do we continue to use that as a vital tool that continue to support peace building and dialogue.
Gotcha. Do you mean so after an agreement is reached, how do we ensure that agreement is kept and protected?
Yeah, and also how do we continue to build peace? Because obviously we know that a peace agreement is only very important, but it's only a step, and that peace need to be continued, need to be sustained, and so having instruments for dialogue and mediation, it's quite crucial to do the hard work of peace building, which we know continues for decades.
Did you have something you wanted to come in with, Heidi?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I suppose sometimes we think about mediation in a very formal manner, in that it's a process of shared dialogue, which goes through the different steps of a shared dialogue process, with a third party, coming to a conclusion and writing an agreement that is hopefully signed together at the end. However, in this project, we wanted to look at mediation a little bit more broadly, which I know this in some cases is a bit of pushback against, but we conceptualize mediation as also more broadly around mediative practice. And I suppose when we're looking at mediation from a peace building perspective, often the idea of the use of mediation skills in larger processes of dialogue or the facilitation of dialogue between different groups, even though it might not be termed specifically mediation in that narrow formal sense, but it still uses those same skills, and therefore it's part of the same, shall we say, umbrella of communication that is required in order to transform relationships, to transform the way that people communicate within the community more broadly, and also to think about transforming those structures of inequality that exist between various groups. So I suppose that was one of the major areas of the project, is to look at mediation more broadly beyond that kind of narrower approach.
You've both spoken quite eloquently there about how transformative mediation might sound philosophical, but how it actually works in practice. And that segues quite nicely into my next question. So from your perspectives, how does that approach differ from more conventional peace-building models?
I guess we initially found inspiration in transformative mediation. It is theorized by Bush and Folger, and that's a very open-ended process that it mainly focuses on the empowerment of the parties. But actually, as the research developed, we came to develop our own definition of transformative mediation, which is essentially to connect mediation and peace building and inclusion. So there are three pillars to how we think about transformative mediation. And so how do we ensure that mediation becomes an instrument of conflict transformation, and also an instrument that can allow what is at the core of conflict transformation, which is not only to transform the conflict parties, but also to transform the root causes and the inequalities that are at the core of conflict. So I think that after the research, we had a much more concrete way of actually establishing our own ways of thinking about transformative mediation, which is not necessarily connected to the original formulation that Bush and Folger had, but is more inspired by both the contributors from the research that we conducted, a variety of mediators, peace builders, activists, but also by combining it with the work that we have done within feminist research, that it's more interested in thinking about peace as something that continues for a long time. And so dialogue and transformative mediation need to be framed in that.
Yeah. So it's not simply a box-ticking exercise or something tokenistic, it's something that is ongoing.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So now that we understand the concept, let's look at how that works on the ground if we can. So the toolkit that you guys are responsible for putting together, it talks about inclusion, intersectionality, and broadening spaces for dialogue. Are you able to give an example of how those principles are put into practice within peace building work?
Great, yeah, thank you. So I suppose this toolkit was developed through dialogue with peacebuilding practitioners and mediation practitioners from across the island of Ireland. We ran a number of focus groups with those working in a variety of different areas, particularly in community peacebuilding, who again use mediative practice within their work, and so within the cohort that we were interviewing for the research, we found a diversity of different methods, shall we say, of dialogue, and this included, for example, in the arts, in sports, in cultural activities. And so we kind of reframed the idea of facilitating dialogue in in alternative spaces using, as I say, the arts and so on. We also looked at ways that dialogue can be arts practice can be used as part of a dialogue process. So, for example, using visuals to be a reference point for dialogue as it goes through the process, through a mediation process. Sorry, I just mumbled. You carry on.
No, that's good.
Maybe another aspect that we can highlight that was as part of the project is that we tried to bring different people in the same room. So some of the people, like Heidi was saying, were mediators and peace builders. Others were people who will identify more as youth workers, or some who were more interested in, feminist activism and LGBTQ rights. So one thing that emerged from the research was also that the thinking beyond silos that often happens, bringing people together who may be working along similar issues or maybe contributing in different ways to peace building, but the people who do not necessarily end up in the same room. So the makeup of the room was also for us interesting in terms of thinking about how do we build an inclusive dialogue? So one of the recommendations was precisely to think beyond silos. And so very often you have gender experts or people working with the women, peace and security agenda. You have artists in another group. You have people dealing with youth. But what about bringing all these people together? And so there was a comment as well that emerged from the participants that they found really helpful to actually be sitting in a room and having conversations across their expertise and experiences.
And also, I think as part of those processes, it was more about recognizing that people working in these specific sectors, as Maria says, in women's rights and LGBT rights, minority group inclusion initiatives, that they're all using mediative practice. And it's about getting to think about their work also within that umbrella of mediation that is often very, very transformative, but it's not recognized within the umbrella of mediation practice.
Gotcha. When you, Maria, you were talking about silos there, the word, the term that sprung to mind was echo chambers. And we hear that quite often, like mostly in online spaces, about how people just talk to people who agree with them or maybe have similar experiences. Whereas it sounds like this has helped go beyond that there to include actual diverse voices and perspectives. Heidi, you touched on something about I think it was, I can't remember exactly your term, but the medium through which we create dialogue or facilitate dialogue. So Talk4Peace does emphasize creativity quite a bit. So how are storytelling, visual tools and trauma-informed methods, how are they used in practice?
Yeah, so storytelling in particular is particularly important. I suppose it's about providing those spaces to hear different stories and through that gain an understanding of alternative truths. Yeah. Because we are, we live in quite a polarized world at the moment, and often particularly with, shall we say, the role of social media and so on, these narratives become very, very entrenched and polarized. And so part of the process of transformative mediation or transformative dialogue more broadly is about using storytelling through a different various mediums. Could be through, stories themselves, or it could be through theatre, it could be through poetry, through visual art, that it actually creates a different alternative understandings of experience, but also alternative visions for peace as well. Because often we think about peace building as looking at the past, but we also need to be thinking about visions for the future as well. So I think that's all also part of the process.
Brilliant. I want to move on to what lessons have emerged from seeing this in action. So what insights have emerged about what helps or what hinders, genuine dialogue?
I think that a couple of things that emerged, again, from participants was that very often there is a time-limited approach. Okay. And so that puts time constraints, because obviously there is kind of like this logic of having a project and bringing people together. And the reality was that for many of our participants, there was a need to continue dialogue, and the dialogue necessary to build peace cannot have a time stamp. So the question of long-term investment, and particularly investment in projects and in knowledges that work, was something that was highlighted by our participants. Sometimes they felt that there is this idea of innovation that needs to be, for people who want to provide innovative solutions, but sometimes the solutions are not necessarily innovative. They are already there. There's people with a lot of experience and knowledge. And so rather than think about, always looking for the new things, there was an idea, why don't we instead support the long-standing networks and connections that exist there? So to think about the sustainable funding and also a much more long-term investment in these spaces, it was certainly something that was highlighted by our participants.
How has this work challenged assumptions about conflict and peace building, in your opinion?
So I suppose one of the assumptions is often this very simplistic idea that you sign a peace agreement and then it's all grand, Which, of course, peace requires a lot of work, sustained work over a long period of time. And often that work is often carried out at the community level. But it also highlights that the project itself also highlighted the need for this continued emphasis on peace building beyond this idea of kind of very top-down kind of political peace, which is not always inclusive. So it really, it challenges that assumption that that peace building is a project that can be finished, and actually it's an ongoing project for which dialogue and innovative mechanisms for dialogue are a priority in the long term. And it also requires that continued support for a diversity of individuals and diversity of voices in that project beyond those that we always hear. And I think that was what we tried to do in this project, was to include those that would not normally be seen as peace builders, but are doing that work anyway. As we mentioned before, those that are working on integration of new communities, for example, youth workers, as I say, those that are working around LGBT rights, women's rights. There are often a lot of voices beyond those that we often hear in the kind of, shall we say, in the media and in that space, in that space, but beyond those that are always seen.
It just reminds me of a discussion that we have quite often in mediation, and I, both internally and externally, is we stress to organisations the importance of mediation as a proactive tool. It's not, don't just view it as something that when there is a conflict then you go, okay, I have to bring this person in now to help with this. If we embed mediative practices throughout an organization, then those things like conflict are less likely to occur, or when they do occur, as they inevitably will, they are handled sort of in a healthier way. It seems, Maria, that this approach, it's as much about self-awareness as communication. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. But also thinking about, spaces for communication. So how do we build those spaces? How do we think about venues, for example? That was a very practical recommendation that we put in the toolkit. Mm-hmm. How do we maybe think beyond the usual spaces of peace building? How do we include, for example, spaces for cultural production that may be less daunting for people? One of our participants said, sometimes you invite people to do an art project and they may be more willing to participate than if you tell them, can you come and talk about the problems in your community? Okay. So it is about using creativity in that sense and thinking about communication, not only in terms of dialogue of people talking to each other, but also facilitating the spaces. And also think about different methods. That I think that there was a key emphasis in our project. We also did a podcast as part of that, and the podcast was specifically looking at interviewing people who use, different art forms. We had the theater of witness. We also spoke to some colleagues who have done research in Colombia, and they've used stitching and knitting as a way of, for example, bringing together different communities in Colombia who had different views on the peace process, including former combatants. And so we were interested in thinking about, how do we think about communication beyond the spoken word, but also in a way that it engages different community. And so we have some different ideas on how we can do that. Also because, for example, again, another participant said that sometimes the written form can be quite daunting for certain communities. So how do we make spaces that actually utilize creativity in terms also to think about communication, so that things are made more accessible, less worrying, or less daunting than come and talk about conflict, essentially.
Yeah. And I suppose just to add to that as well, given the focus on trauma, and we spoke a lot, we addressed this issue of a trauma-informed approach to mediation and dialogue processes. While there is a kind of greater emphasis nowadays on recognizing the role of trauma in the ability for people to be able to dialogue and communicate, it can get forgotten in processes that are not that are very formalized, shall we say. So, in a sense, this kind of the focus more on creativity was considered from the perspective of being of a trauma-informed approach, that it's not about, putting a lot of pressure on individuals to reveal their stories, but it's about creating the spaces where they can feel comfortable, if they want, to be able to reveal it and to talk about their own experiences, and to be sensitive to the to issues of trauma that may be very present without being immediately visible.
Thank you, Heidi. You spoke about trauma and informed practices, trauma-informed mediation. I know that one of our associates here at Mediation NI, Sarah Cook, also speaks beautifully about that subject. We had her on an earlier podcast episode, and I mean, it was something that I wasn't aware of in the least, but I genuinely could have listened to her talk for hours about it, just the way she spoke about it with such passion. It was lovely to see. You've both spoken very, very well about the minutiae, or you've spoken about specifics. It's lovely hearing the feedback that you've been given as well on this. I want to, if we can, sort of zoom out to maybe look at the bigger picture within Ireland. So, Heidi, you have mapped unmet mediation needs across Ireland. How do you find these findings connect to what Talk4Peace is about?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I've just finished a piece of research which was commissioned by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and it was developed with community law and mediation in Dublin, and I was working as a consultant on their behalf to carry out this research. But this was specifically focusing on unmet mediation need, particularly amongst socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. So specifically, we looked at those that were generally in disadvantaged positions, but also specific communities, for example, traveller communities, those at risk of homelessness, youth, and environmental groups also. And I suppose one thing that came up frequently in the research was a lack of knowledge of what mediation is. And because of a lack of knowledge, there was a lack of desire, shall we say, to participate in mediation processes that might be beneficial. And I think one of the points that came up was that, again, around this very narrow understanding of mediation, that by broadening it out to understanding mediation, to be inclusive of mediation practices, it can be more community orientated and therefore has the possibility of reaching communities beyond, shall we say, in the field of like workplace mediation or very commercial mediation, family mediation, and so on. So it connected to Talk4Peace very much in that sense that there is a lack of inclusivity because of that lack of knowledge, shall we say, of what the practice is and how those can engage with it. Of course, beyond those findings as well, I found that there was a lack of funding for mediation, particularly community mediation in Ireland more generally. I should say that it was focused on the south of Ireland, this particular project, and the process was carried out through interviewing representatives from organisations that are working with communities within the cohort that I mentioned. But I also found some incredible programmes that are ongoing. For example, with in the traveller community, for example, who use the traveller mediation service, do incredible work with on intra and inter traveller conflicts, shall we say, or tensions, but also do so much work around what they call dialogue days, which is about engaging mediative practice in spaces where they bring together individuals from the traveller community or other individuals from state institutions or from the guards and from a settled community in the area where there may be tension, and they facilitate dialogue in a kind of in this sort of similar way that we might see in Peacebuilding. So these initiatives are ongoing, but they're often quite niche, shall we say?
Yeah.
So that type of practice was very much consistent with the work of Talk4Peace. So it was nice to see that where that's ongoing in a context which is not necessarily seen specifically as a conflict context, but we can conceptualize conflict beyond, political violence, but that also is ongoing at the community level. Yeah.
Do you think it's sort of like a chicken and egg scenario where better inclusivity would lead to better knowledge, but equally better knowledge would lead to better inclusivity?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But it's what are the mechanisms there to facilitate that knowledge, and that's what's required: the better advocacy and better accessibility, and that has to be done through innovative programs as well, because we can't assume that everybody has the same access to mechanisms for learning or for understanding. We might also take into consideration different literacy levels and so on, and this is why things like using alternative methods to promote mediation is so important.
Yeah, making things equitable as opposed to equal.
Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Maria, we're coming to the end almost, unfortunately, and which is quite annoying because you guys have spoken beautifully, and I really could just continue listening. Maria, what do you hope Talk4Peace will inspire in mediators, policymakers, or in communities and workplaces going forward?
I think when we completed the project, I think we were quite hopeful that we don't want to be prescriptive, in the sense that we are aware that a lot of the ideas come from the people that we interviewed here, the people who contributed, and we consider them as, co-creators. But we are also aware that a lot of those ideas are very much context specific. So the way in which we drafted the toolkit was to provide some inspiration for others. We hoped that is going to be a useful resource for rethinking and applying some of those ideas to different contexts. And we also had an opportunity to meet different people and to share the toolkit with other organizations. We were invited, for example, to provide a training to Scottish mediation. And so to meet with some of the mediators there to talk about, for example, intersectionality. And so we thought that was actually a really interesting opportunity for us. It was clear, for example, that speaking to mediators, that while they may not necessarily knew that they were using intersectionality, or they wouldn't use the word intersectionality, actually having the workshops with them was really insightful in showing that actually they had a very good appreciation of the multiple ways in which people can be excluded or included. So that was a very practical way of seeing maybe some of the application of our research to a wider context beyond the island of Ireland. So I'm hoping that this is going to be helpful. I've shared it with our students at Queen's. We have a conflict transformation and social justice MA and a specific module on conflict mediation and transformation. And so all of the insights from the project, as well as collaboration with Mediation Northern Ireland, are filtered through that module. And so I'm hoping that, our students will use some of those insights, just like I am using them in my everyday life, not only in our research.
If we were to come back, and speaking hypothetically, if we were to come back in 5 years' time, was that what success would look like to you for Talk4Peace, or would you maybe even take it a step further for both of you?
Absolutely. I think it's about creating spaces for new ideas in this field amongst practitioners, but also amongst policymakers as well. And we did do a few workshops with or events rather at the EU level with the European Peacebuilding Liaison Organisation, for example, which we, I suppose, showcased the toolkit to a number of civil society organisations and peacebuilding organisations at the EU level, and we've got a lot of interest there. And we've had those other peacebuilding organisations that are working in conflict contexts globally interested in the toolkit, as well as from the Department of Foreign Affairs as well, which has been great. So we hope that it's had some sort of impact, and some of the ideas within the programme will be taken on board. But yeah, more broadly, it's great to have that engagement at the community level as well with some of these ideas. So yes,
absolutely. And like with a lot of these initiatives, they start from the ground up rather than the top down.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Heidi, Maria, thank you both so much for sharing your work. Talk4Peace really, I think it really does show us how mediation can grow beyond casework into actual culture and a way of seeing people differently. Listeners can explore the full toolkit report at talk4peace.com, is that correct? Yes. And they can also find the Unmet Mediation Need report. We'll have that on our site, mediationni.org. I've been Aaron Kelly, and this has been The Resolution Room. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, dialogue changes everything.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.